So one of the saints, who I didn't know, who was really in the background of my childhood growing up, was Milton Bradley. So I grew up with the Milton Bradley Company playing the Game of Life and Candyland and Yahtzee. I think at one point the Milton Bradley Company had like, I don't know, 300 or 400 games. And they were also the sponsor in my childhood of most of the television shows. So you just kind of grew up with Milton Bradley. And I never thought about the fact that there was a real person named Milton Bradley until I read a book by Jill Lepore, that Harvard historian, who talked about how you can really kind of track the history of the United States through the evolution of board games, kind of through how they evolved from being about morality to being about money. And Milton Bradley, his family came here to the United States very before there were United States in the 1600s, early 1600s. They were kind of part of the first Puritans, and it didn't go well for them. Disease and skirmishes with native peoples, but they weren't looking for things to go well for them. They were all about God's destiny and the fact that they were called to praise God through whatever trial or tribulation came. Milton Bradley was born in 1835 in Lowell, Massachusetts. He was born into a very loving home. His parents loved learning and art and teaching, and his dad couldn't keep a job, and they were always moving about. He was an ambitious young man, and he took some courses in drafting and in lithography, which is like making kind of early prints. And in 1860, he finally hit it rich. He made a lithograph, a print. He made 30,000 of a person who was just becoming well known named Abraham Lincoln, clean shaven Abraham Lincoln. And those prints, he couldn't sell them quickly enough. And then Abraham Lincoln grew a beard and he couldn't sell any of them. And people came to him and they wanted their money back. And he finally had to just burn his inventory. And a good friend came over to kind of console him, cheer him up, and he brought a board game. In those days, the only board games in the United States had been brought in from England. And they weren't kind of games that we would probably think of as fun. They were all kind of overlaid with the very heavy Christian message. And the journey was from sin to salvation. And the goal of every game was to be a moral person, to be patient and charitable. And the games never really ended. They were kind of like eternity. They just went on and they were very dull. And you wanted to do things like avoid working on the Sabbath, you were putting the whipping stocks. It was not a fun thing. So Milton Bradley realized he could make a more fun game. So he made a game with this lithography set, printed the board, and it started selling crazy. It was not about morality. It was not about being a virtuous person. It was about the American dream. It was about making money. There was a little square you could land on called truth, but it had no value. And those board games, the sales went through the roof. He sold like 45,000 in just a matter of months. And then it was time for the Civil War, and he made small versions that the Union soldiers could take in their knapsacks, along with little small versions of checkers and chess and backgammon. It was a huge success. And then it was followed by another huge success. He patented croquet. Before you knew it, he was just making money hand over fist. After 200 and something years, he had finally brought his family to the American dream, and almost overnight, he walked away from it. He had no interest in the games, and he turned his attention for the rest of his life to the kindergarten movement. Somebody took him to a lecture by Elizabeth Peabody, who was a Bostonian woman in the early 1860s, who was all about education, free education for every child in this country, 4, 5, and 6-year-olds. And Milton Bradley went with his father, and he was just absolutely fascinated. He loved to learn. He loved kids. His children became the first kids in the kindergarten. He and his father and wife became the first kindergarten teachers. And he became fascinated with art and how art could really open a child's heart and mind and soul to grow. And we owe it to the Milton Bradley Company that we have like sets of watercolors and the first crayons and the one-armed paper cutter. And even more than that, they made these learning tools for children, and they were called gifts. They were called gifts because it began with this idea that every child had such incredible gifts, and that the role of the adult was simply to bring out and nourish those gifts. And Milton Bradley was enthralled with all of this, and it was a huge drain on his company. Not just because, he was manufacturing all these blocks and trying to adjust all these machines to create these things, but also because he was just giving everything away. I mean, he gave everything to every school that he could reach. And whenever any little kindergarten teacher in the burgeoning movement asked him for something, he tried to create it. So his board of directors finally said, dude, you're finished. You're out of here. And he spent the rest of his life trying to bring art and education to kids. I mean, he may not fit the classic definition of a saint, but oh my goodness, if Abraham Lincoln hadn't grown a beard, he might never have, had to make the board game, which might never have taken him to the lecture on kindergarten, which might mean we'd still be sitting around looking for a clever little way to package watercolors, right? And when I think about somebody like that who impacted my life in a way that I would never have even thought about, and then I think about all the thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people who've done little, small, and big things in this country and changed us. And so many of those saints are just our own private people. I preached a sermon 20 years ago on Easter Sunday about this couple. They weren't well known. They lived not far from where John Lewis grew up, not far from where Fannie Lou Hamer grew up. Someone somehow had given me an article. This woman, May Bertha Carter, had died. And the New York Times, which, tries to do not just the big people's obituary, but some of the small people's obituaries, had an obituary about her. And May Bertha and her husband Matthew, 100 years after Milton Bradley and Elizabeth Peabody were trying to get education and art into every child's hands, there were people in the South giving their life to keep those gifts away from children of color. In the 1960s, people in sheets, people in prominent places, doing everything they could. And May Bertha and Matthew literally risked their lives and their children's lives to change that in Drew, Mississippi. And after I preached a sermon, our own Patty Miller, I think she's in the chat today, came up to me, this was 20 years ago on Easter, and said, they're my cousins. They're my dad's cousins. Now, May Bertha and Matthew grew up in Drew, Mississippi on the Pimble Plantation, and their life was not much different than their parents and their grandparents who were slaves there. Sharecropping, not much of a step up from slavery. You were completely controlled by the plantation owner. You didn't get paid. Once a year, if there was any profit, maybe you would get a little bit of money, but your housing and your credit at the store, it was all dependent on this plantation owner's benevolence. And when May Bertha had the first of her 13 children, she held that child and she said, you're not going to be a sharecropper. You're going to get an education. That wasn't very easy in Mississippi in the 1950s, in the 1960s, any time before that. The children, the black children, they rode the school buses that had been discarded, that were too dangerous for the white children. They had the little textbooks that had been torn apart, the covers missing, the white children who used them, their names all scratched through. The black children were lucky if they got a meal ticket once or twice a week. The white kids all got to eat every single day. Of course, when Brown versus Board was passed in 1954, those separate, unequal schools were outlawed, and the segregation ended finally in Drew, Mississippi in 1970. Because if you didn't grow up in the South or the Southwest, you may not know. I mean, school boards and, people who were before the Proud Boys, they did everything they could to stop it. So in 1964, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, which then finally gave a little bit more teeth and said those school districts that won't desegregate aren't going to get federal money. So the school board in Drew, Mississippi got busy trying to come up with a plan that would look like a desegregation plan. They called it a freedom of choice plan, meaning that the black families could choose, if they wanted to lose their life, to send their children to the white school. The 7 children that were school age in the Carter family all said we're in. The Carters didn't realize they were the only family, the only black family who were willing to take that risk. It was a huge risk. The intimidation was overwhelming. The day after they applied for their children to be in the white school, and May Bertha kept telling them, it's not the white school, it's your school. The day after, Mr. Thornton, say his name, Mr. Thornton, the plantation owner, pulled up in front of their house, and he laid on the horn for Matthew to come out. Matthew came out. May Bertha was on the porch, and he told Matthew, yeah, I heard that you applied for the kids to go to the school. That's not a good idea. That's not going to go well for you. Nobody's going to be supporting nobody. Now, let me just put you in the car right now, and I'll take you right down there, and we can just withdraw the kids right now. May Bertha, by this point, had come out onto the porch with a record player and put on a record of President Kennedy in 1963 giving a speech about civil rights. If we can send American soldiers, black and white, to Vietnam and Berlin, black and white kids can go to school together, right? I mean, when Matthew came back into the house, May Bertha said, I gave birth to those 13 children. I bore the pain of those children. No man is going to tell me what I'm going to do with my children and where they're going to go to school any longer. But that was just the beginning, because that night, they lived like 9 miles out in the middle of the country, and they heard the trucks coming, right, with the weapons, and they hit the floor with those kids before the bullets started spraying. And that was just the beginning of it, folks. I mean, the store cut off their credit. They lost their job. Someone came and bit by bit just tore their house apart. Their 7 children were dead set on going to that school. Debbie was the youngest. She was 6. And she talked about how she would go into the class and the white children would just jump away from the table when she came in. And when she walked down the hall, they'd jump away from her. She used to pray for it to rain, because when it rained, they wouldn't have recess. Then she wouldn't be left out. Then she could just go to the library and read her book. But they stuck with it. Thankfully, there were other saints who came along, the American Friends Service Committee being one. The Quakers, they found them a job. They found them work. They stood with them. They stayed with them. And 11 of the 13 Carter kids graduated from college. 7 from the formerly all-white University of Mississippi. This is a scary time in our country. It's a frightening time. It's hard to know what's going to happen. It's hard to know what the next few days will bring. We so hope it will be peace and the beginning of a new way of us living bravely and courageously. For me, I'm going to do everything I can to bring those saints from the background into the foreground. To think, it was during the Civil War that people were getting together to dream about the first kindergartens, where every child in this country would be invited to bring their gifts and share them. I'm going to spend this week thinking about May Bertha and Matthew and how frightened they were and how they still acted with courage. May Bertha said they spent those first 3 nights on the floor, frightened of the bullets. And then she remembered something the preacher had said at a mass meeting, that you could be afraid, but you couldn't let it control you. And so she said it was like a peace covered her over. And she said after that, we never hit the floor again. May this amazing country, full of so many saints, full of so many people who know what it means to be blessed for persecution's sake, who know what it means to be pure in spirit, all those people who've sought to be merciful, who've sought to care and love, all of those people who've claimed their own gifts and said, we will stop at nothing until God invites all of us to share. May the witness of all those amazing people, the Miltons, the May Berthas and Matthews, all of those people who have made us who we are, may we proudly live in their form and their fashion. Amen.